January 17, 2008. British Airways Flight 38 was approaching London Heathrow after flying from Beijing. On board the Boeing 777 were 152 people, most of them expecting nothing more than a routine landing. The aircraft was descending normally through the cold winter air. Inside the cabin, passengers were preparing for arrival. Seatbelts were fastened, tray tables were secured, and the flight attendants were getting ready for landing. Everything appeared completely normal. But inside the cockpit, the pilots were about to face a nightmare. As Flight 38 descended toward Heathrow, both engines suddenly began losing power. The pilots immediately pushed the throttles forward, but the response was not what they expected. The engines were still turning, but they were no longer producing enough thrust. The aircraft began losing speed. The runway was getting closer, yet the Boeing 777 was struggling to stay in the air. The pilots had only seconds to make critical decisions. Ahead was Heathrow's runway 27L. The aircraft was now dangerously low, and there was almost no altitude available for recovery. Inside the cabin, passengers could feel something was wrong. The aircraft was descending rapidly. Some people looked out of the windows and saw the ground approaching far too quickly. Then the plane crossed the airport boundary. It was too low. The pilots desperately tried to stretch the aircraft's remaining glide toward the runway, but Flight 38 could not reach it. The Boeing 777 touched down on the grass just short of the runway. The impact was brutal. The landing gear collapsed, and the aircraft slammed across the ground. A huge jet skidded forward, throwing debris across the grass. Passengers screamed as the aircraft shook violently. For a few terrifying seconds, nobody knew what would happen next. Would the aircraft break apart? Would the fuel ignite? Would everyone escape? The pilots fought to keep the aircraft under control as it continued sliding toward the runway. Then finally, the Boeing 777 came to a stop. Silence filled the cabin. Passengers looked around, shocked by what had just happened. Emergency crews were already racing toward the aircraft. Smoke and debris surrounded the plane, but something incredible had happened. The aircraft had survived the impact, and so had the people inside it. But investigators would soon discover that this terrifying accident was caused by a hidden problem involving ice, fuel, and the extreme cold. The mystery of why both engines lost power had only just begun. The Boeing 777 had finally stopped. For a few seconds, the cabin was strangely quiet. Then the reality of what had happened began to sink in. British Airways Flight 38 had come down just short of Heathrow's runway after losing power from both engines. The aircraft had slammed into the ground, its landing gear had collapsed, and the massive jet had skidded across the grass. Yet the unimaginable had happened. The aircraft was still largely intact, and 152 people were alive. Emergency crews rushed toward the plane. Firefighters prepared for the possibility of a fuel fire as passengers began evacuating through the emergency exits. Some passengers were injured, but there was no catastrophic fire. One by one, people escaped the aircraft. Many were terrified. Some were crying. Others simply stood on the ground in disbelief, staring back at the damaged Boeing 777. They had expected a normal landing. Instead, they had just survived one of the most frightening aviation emergencies in modern British history. But investigators now faced a crucial question. Why had both engines lost power? The aircraft had been operating normally for most of the flight. There had been no obvious engine failure before the final approach. The investigation eventually uncovered a remarkable chain of events. The flight had passed through extremely cold conditions. Ice had accumulated within the aircraft's fuel system. During the descent, when the engines suddenly demanded more fuel, the accumulated ice restricted the fuel flow. The engines could not receive enough fuel. Without sufficient fuel flow, they could not produce the thrust required to keep the aircraft flying normally. That explained why the pilots suddenly found themselves fighting a powerless aircraft only moments before landing. Their response was critical. With very little altitude remaining, they concentrated on keeping the aircraft under control and reaching the airport. Although they could not reach the runway itself, they managed to bring the aircraft down in a way that allowed the fuselage to remain largely intact. The accident caused serious damage to the aircraft, but the loss of life that many feared never happened. All 152 people on board survived. The crash became a powerful lesson for the aviation industry. It demonstrated how a seemingly small problem inside a complex system could develop into a life-threatening emergency within seconds. It also showed the importance of pilot skill and decision-making under extreme pressure. Flight 38 was eventually written off, but its story was far from forgotten. A modern passenger jet had lost power from both engines during its final approach. It landed short of the runway, and despite the terrifying impact, every person on board survived. British Airways Flight 38 became more than an aviation accident. It became a story of technology, investigation, human skill, and an extraordinary escape from disaster.